This is Prep Mode 911. If you're hearing this, well, you're probably not. But I still say it. Every night. Habit, I guess. Once upon a time, this voice bounced off broken buildings, into ruined homes. Now it just echoes in my head. Still, I talk. Because silence kills. Tonight, I'm not in the shelter. I'm not even in the ruins. Something happened. Be careful, tonight, we're going to try to make it through another one of these long nights together. Z. The air, it was the first thing. Not just cold, but old. A damp, earthen chill that seeped into my bones, tasting of forgotten rain and upturned soil. My eyes fluttered, heavy, against the sudden press of darkness, a darkness so profound it felt organic. Like I was buried. Not quite, no, but close. My face was pressed against something yielding, yet firm, something that smelled of decay and fresh, rich loam. My hands, when I finally managed to push them against it, sank slightly, collecting a fine, gritty residue that stuck to my skin. Mud. Cold, slick mud. The kind that holds the memory of every raindrop, every root, every buried thing. I pushed myself up, slowly, muscles protesting, a dull ache blooming in my left shoulder. The world tilted, a dizzying spiral of black on black, then settled into a vague, shadowy outline. Trees. Everywhere. And not the manicured, carefully preserved kind I knew, but a wild, untamed tangle of ancient things, their branches like skeletal fingers against a barely there sky. I coughed, a dry, rasping sound that felt alien in the overwhelming quiet. Where was the hum? The distant drone of forgotten generators, the occasional crackle of broken power lines, the whispers of the wind through shattered window panes? All gone. Replaced by a silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 years of undisturbed earth. My head pounded, a rhythmic throb behind my eyes, and a metallic taste coated my tongue. I ran my hand over my face, finding a smear of mud, cool and gritty. My clothes, usually a reliable second skin of worn-in tactical gear, felt different. Heavier. Rougher. As if they'd absorbed centuries of dampness. I tried to remember the last thing. The scavenging run. The usual route through what was left of the old city. The sudden, blinding flash, then nothing. Now this. Cold. Wet. And utterly, terrifyingly, silent. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure, a feeling of vastness above me, made me look up. No broken concrete skyline, no skeletal remains of skyscrapers clawing at the moon. Just an impossibly vast canopy of stars, brighter than any I had ever seen, each one a pinprick of frozen light in a velvet void. And between them, the ghostly silhouette of branches, swaying almost imperceptibly, exhaling a scent of pine and something else, something wild and green that resonated deep in my primal brain. This wasn't the world I knew anymore. Not by a long shot. The sheer, terrifying scale of the silence, the alien feel of the air, the cold, damp earth beneath me, it all screamed it. You probably won't survive this, a little voice whispered in the back of my mind, cool and unbothered. And it might just be right. My breath plumed in the frigid air, a ghost in the ancient night. My fingers, still gritty with mud, found the familiar hilt of my scavenged knife, a small comfort in the vast unknown. But even that felt wrong. Heavier, somehow. Like it had forgotten its purpose. What was I even doing here? My mind raced, grappling with the impossible. A dream? A hallucination brought on by whatever gas I might have inhaled back in the ruins? My hand went to my chest, feeling for the familiar hum of my old world tech, my comms unit, my trusty flashlight. Nothing. Just the rough weave of unfamiliar fabric. The cold began to truly set in, a creeping chill that promised hypothermia if I didn't move. Survival, I reminded myself. First rule. Find shelter. Find warmth. Find answers. But answers felt miles away, buried under centuries of something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The moss on the rocks beside me felt ancient, soft under my fingers, a silent witness to a world that had forgotten me. The very ground seemed to breathe, a slow, deep exhalation that stirred the faint scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. It was a world entirely remade, stripped back to something primal and terrifying. And I, somehow, had been stripped back with it. And if you're still with me, tell me, fellow traveler, where in the world are you listening from? What's your local time? Update your status update. Tell me. Did you ever steal ripe fruit? From the overgrown gardens of a world that forgot your name? Did you drink from a river? Without asking what century it had flowed through? Have you hidden in cellars lined with salt and sorrow? Flinching at every footstep? Across floorboards older than your own bloodline? Do you still remember how to spark fire from stone? Can your fingers still find north? I want to hear from you. Scroll down. Drop a comment. Write like you're leaving a journal entry, like you're leaving a sign for someone else to find. You don't need to be tough, just be real. Me. I'll read every word. Maybe I won't reply right away, but I'm still here. And if you're hearing this, it means you're still breathing. And in this world, that's a damn miracle. Now, soften the candlelight, the stars are out, the pine trees carry a gentle scent, and I've just lit a small fire. And you can turn on a fan for that soft background hum. It's the perfect time to ease into tonight's journey together. My ruined city echoes were not here. No skeletal towers scraped the bruised sky, no broken roads wound like forgotten veins through concrete rubble. Here, the ruins were different, softer. As the first pale blush of dawn stained the eastern sky, I pushed myself to my feet, my body stiff and complaining, every joint a rusted hinge. The trees, which had been monstrous shadows in the deepest dark, now revealed themselves as ancient sentinels, their gnarled trunks draped in thick, velvety moss, their branches interwoven so tightly they formed a cathedral ceiling. I stumbled forward, my boots sinking into the damp, leafy undergrowth. Or rather, what I thought were my boots. They felt heavier, laced with rough hide, and the thick soles seemed to collect every damp leaf and twig. My jeans, too, were gone, replaced by thick, homespun trousers that chafed against my skin. It was disorienting, this sudden shift in material reality. Like waking up in someone else's costume party, except the party was real, and you were the only one who didn't get the memo. As I walked, the forest slowly thinned, revealing glimpses of crumbling stone structures swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Not the sharp, jagged remains of a modern collapse, but the rounded, gentle decay of centuries. These weren't buildings destroyed by bombs or neglect, but by time itself, patiently reclaimed by the earth. A broken archway, half buried in a mound of ivy-covered earth. A wall, its stones once meticulously laid, now a patchwork of green and gray, barely discernible from the forest floor. It was beautiful, in a haunting, mournful way. Like seeing the ghost of a city, not a corpse. One particular structure caught my eye, a tower, still standing mostly intact, its upper reaches crowned with a riot of wildflowers. It looked medieval. Like something out of a storybook. And my gut, that primal survival instinct that had kept me alive in the post-apocalyptic world, screamed at me that this wasn't a historical reenactment. This was real. The air hummed with an unfamiliar silence, broken only by the chirping of birds, birds whose calls I didn't recognize, and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. No distant traffic, no faint whispers of wind turbines, no crackle of old radio signals. Just nature. Raw and unfiltered. A mainstream historical fact that popped into my head, strangely, was about medieval building materials. You know, back then, they didn't really have the concept of engineered wood or structural steel. It was all about local resources. Stone, timber, thatch. Which explained why so many of these structures, even after centuries, were still somewhat identifiable. They were built to last, using what the land provided. Kind of ironic, isn't it? We build our cities to reach for the sky, with all our fancy materials, and they crumble in a generation. They built theirs to hug the earth, and they outlast empires. I stumbled upon what looked like an old, overgrown pathway, barely visible beneath a carpet of moss and fallen leaves. Following it, I noticed a peculiar detail. Scattered amongst the usual forest debris were bits of broken pottery, not the mass-produced ceramics I was used to, but rough, hand-fired shards, some with faint, almost erased patterns. They looked like they'd been there for centuries, slowly returning to the earth. An archaeologist in my old world would have had a field day. Me? I just wanted a coffee. Or, failing that, a clear signpost. This way to the nearest Starbucks, circa 1347 AD, something, anything. As I moved deeper into what felt like a forgotten settlement, a faint, rhythmic sound began to drift on the breeze. Dong, dong, dong. It was a bell. Not the harsh, metallic clang of a modern fire alarm, or the cheerful chime of a church clock, but a deep, resonant peal, slightly off-key, carrying a distinct medieval cadence. Monastery bells. The sound, heavy and slow, wrapped around me, a tangible thread pulling me further into this impossible reality. Disbelief warred with a terrifying certainty. This wasn't some isolated pocket of wilderness. This was an active, breathing, medieval world. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the overwhelming silence. A chill, colder than the damp air, seeped into my soul. This was it. No going back. Not yet, anyway. The thought settled in my stomach like a lead weight. Many documents leave open the possibility that these bells, particularly those in isolated monastic communities, were not only for timekeeping or religious ceremonies. Some suggest they were also used to mark territorial boundaries, their sound acting as an invisible fence, warning outsiders of the monastic presence. There is no consensus on this matter. And perhaps, there will never be consensus. All I knew was that the sound was drawing me in, whether I wanted it to or not. It felt like a beckoning, a call from another time. A call that, against my better judgment, I felt compelled to answer. It was a bizarre kind of holy sound, a low, persistent hum against the background of my growing panic, a sound that made me feel both profoundly lost and strangely, disturbingly, found. My stomach rumbled, a stark reminder of my very modern need for sustenance. I still had the lingering taste of protein bar in my mouth, a ghost of a taste from a world that no longer existed. Here, I suspected, food would be earned, not unwrapped. The thought made my throat tighten. This wasn't just a time travel trip, it was a crash course in survival. And I was failing the first lesson. At least I still had my wits. And a healthy dose of pure, unadulterated terror. Which, if I was honest, was a pretty good motivator. The faint, rhythmic dong, 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 of the medieval bells grew steadily louder as I pushed deeper through the thinning woods. It wasn't the crisp, melodious chime of a perfectly cast modern bell, but a deeper, more resonant thrum, carrying a raw, earthen quality, as if the sound itself had been hammered from the very rock of the earth. Each peal vibrated through the soles of my rough, unfamiliar shoes, up my legs, and into my chest, a physical presence in the otherwise overwhelmingly quiet landscape. It felt ancient, heavy with history, a sound that had echoed across countless sunrises and sunsets, marking the passage of time for generations long gone. It wasn't a comforting sound, not exactly, but it was a known sound, a human sound, in a world that felt increasingly alien. The disbelief, which had been a gnawing whisper in the back of my mind, now solidified into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some elaborate simulation. This was undeniably, terrifyingly real. I was here. In the medieval era. Me, who still occasionally yearned for a hot shower and a stable Wi-Fi signal. It was a bizarre, almost comical thought, the sheer absurdity of it all, if I hadn't been so utterly terrified. It was like going camping, only to realize you'd set up your tent in the middle of a live-action historical documentary, and everyone else had forgotten to give you the script. As I broke through the final screen of trees, the world opened up before me. And there it was. Not a bustling metropolis, but a small, unassuming cluster of structures, nestled in a valley by a winding river. Smoke curled lazily from thatched roofs, gray against the pastel hues of the pre-dawn sky. It was a village. A living, breathing medieval village. My breath hitched. This was it. First contact, as it were. My instincts, honed by years of scavenging and hiding in a world that had forgotten civility, kicked in. I immediately ducked back into the cover of the tree lean, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to observe. To understand. To not, under any circumstances, stride out into the open like a startled deer. My modern clothing, or what had become my modern clothing, a thick, coarse tunic and breeches that felt suspiciously like wool, would still mark me as an anomaly. And in a world that probably hadn't seen anyone from beyond their immediate valley, anomaly usually translated to threat or witchcraft. Neither boded well for my continued survival. Peeking through a curtain of damp leaves, I saw them. Peasants. Or, well, what I assumed were peasants. They were emerging from small, rough-hewn dwellings, moving with a purposeful slowness in the gray light. Their clothes were simple, undyed fabrics, linsey-woolsey, probably, a mix of linen and wool, a common textile in the Middle Ages. They carried wooden buckets, or wore rough, woven baskets slung over their arms. Their faces were weathered, etched with hard living, but their movements were fluid, accustomed to the rhythms of dawn. An interesting detail, one that scholars still debate, is how early medieval people structured their days. While the church bells marked canonical hours, the actual rhythm of peasant life was largely dictated by the sun and the seasons, often working from dawn till dusk. Some historians argue that this gave them a more natural connection to their environment, while others point to the sheer exhaustion it must have entailed. Me? I just wondered if they had coffee. A man, broad-shouldered and stooped, led a scrawny, bleeding goat out of a small pen. A woman, her head covered by a simple coif, emerged from another hut, carrying a clay pot. They moved without haste, without the frantic, hurried energy of modern life. There was a quiet dignity to their movements, a sense of being deeply rooted in their time and place. It was profoundly unnerving to witness, like watching an old film suddenly spring to life around you. I crouched lower, letting the damp earth seep into my kneecaps, a small price to pay for remaining unseen. The air here was heavy with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something I couldn't quite place, perhaps the faint, musky scent of livestock, or the lingering aroma of last night's cooked root vegetables. It was the smell of human habitation, medieval style. My stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing protest against my current circumstances. Even in a post-apocalyptic world, I'd had access to scavenged canned goods. Here, food seemed to be grown. Or hunted. Or, in my case, desperately longed for. One of the men, older, with a wispy beard, crossed himself before he began his chores, a quick, almost automatic gesture. It was a common sight, even in my old world, but here, it felt different. More integrated. A sign from God, perhaps. Or just habit. The line between the two, in this time, seemed blurrier than the straight lines of a modern grid system. This was a deeply religious world, where faith was not just a Sunday affair, but woven into the very fabric of daily existence. It was a world where divine justice, not human law, was often the ultimate arbiter. I, a product of a skeptical age, felt a strange awe at the pervasive nature of their belief. And then, a quirky, unusual detail caught my eye. The man who was leading the goat, as he passed a low stone wall, he leaned down and touched a small, almost invisible carving on one of the stones. It looked like a stylized fish. He didn't linger, just a quick brush of his fingers, almost a secret gesture. I'd read something about early Christian symbols, how during periods of persecution, they'd use symbols like the ichthys, fish, as a secret sign. Could this be it? A remnant of an even earlier time, still respected, still quietly observed? It was a small, fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes about the layers of history, belief, and superstition that ran through this place. The ancients recount such hidden signs, subtle marks left on homes or pathways to ward off evil or signify belonging, but the evidence is scarce, and rumors are plentiful. I couldn't help but wonder if this tiny fish carving was a silent prayer, a hidden blessing, or something else entirely. Whatever it was a reminder that I was now in a world where belief shaped reality in ways my modern mind could barely grasp. I stayed hidden, a ghost among the ancient trees, observing the village as the sun finally crested the distant hills, painting the thatched roofs in shades of gold and amber. The air, initially heavy with the dampness of dawn, now took on a crisp, cool quality, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and something vaguely earthy, like freshly turned soil. My stomach growled again, louder this time, a mournful lament that echoed the profound emptiness within me. I ignored it, focusing instead on the figures emerging from their homes, a slow procession towards what I soon realized was the village well. It was a simple structure, a stone-lined circle with a wooden bucket on a rope, set beneath a sprawling, ancient oak tree. The women, mostly, converged there, their simple linen and wool garments a muted tapestry against the vibrant green of the surrounding fields. They moved with an economy of motion born of daily ritual, pulling up buckets of water, their hands calloused and strong. The clatter of the wooden bucket against the stone, the soft splash of water, the low murmur of voices, these were the sounds of life, of community, of a world that was utterly indifferent to my modern predicament. I pressed myself further into the shadows, a witness to a scene that felt both mundane and utterly surreal. This wasn't just a source of water, it was the village's social hub, the medieval equivalent of a coffee shop or a water cooler. As they filled their buckets, their voices rose, a low hum of gossip and daily concerns. I strained to hear, my ears still ringing with the impossible journey, trying to decipher their dialect. It was an older form of English, heavily accented, laced with words and pronunciations that were almost, but not quite, familiar. Like listening to a song you dimly remember from childhood, played on a broken record player. One woman, her face a web of wrinkles, leaned conspiratorially towards another, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "They say, the sickness is spreading." Sickness. My blood ran cold. Plague. The word hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. This was a mainstream historical fact I knew all too well, the Black Death, and the constant fear of pestilence that haunted medieval Europe. It wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a daily, terrifying reality. The whispered word, sickness, carried the weight of millions of deaths, a shadow that stretched across centuries. Another woman sighed, her gaze fixed on the distant, bell-tolling monastery. God's wrath, surely. For our sins. Religious elements, right on cue. The pervasive belief that illness was a divine curse, a punishment for human transgression. It wasn't just a theological concept, it was their primary framework for understanding the world, for coping with the inexplicable horrors that visited them. They wouldn't talk about bacteria or viruses, they talked about saints and penance. It made a strange kind of sense, if you were trying to find comfort in a world where medicine was rudimentary and understanding was limited. Many documents leave open the possibility that during outbreaks, acts of extreme penance, like flagellation, became more common, believed to appease divine anger. There is no consensus on this matter, and perhaps there will never be consensus on how much it truly offered solace versus simply adding to the suffering. Then came a quirky, unusual detail. A young girl, no older than 10, carefully poured a small amount of water from her bucket onto the ground, tracing a cross in the damp earth with her finger. She muttered something under her breath, a tiny, fervent prayer. It wasn't a grand ritual, just a small, private act of devotion, a personal appeal to a higher power for protection. It reminded me that faith wasn't just about grand cathedrals and public declarations, it was woven into the smallest, most intimate gestures of daily life. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking little act of hope in the face of overwhelming fear. I overheard bits and pieces of their conversations. Talk of a bad harvest, of missing sheep, of a new baby born to the miller's wife. Mundane, everyday concerns, utterly oblivious to the temporal anomaly crouched just beyond their sightline. It was a bizarre kind of reality check. Here I was, grappling with the fabric of time and space, and they were worried about the price of grain. It was almost funny, in a dark, twisted sort of way. My problems were cosmic, theirs were existential, but on a much more immediate, tangible level. As the sun climbed higher, the villagers began to disperse, their buckets filled, their conversations trailing off into the crisp morning air. My hunger, ignored for too long, began to gnaw at me with renewed ferocity. My modern instincts screamed for a way to communicate, to explain, to find a store, an ATM, anything. But here, communication was through shared experience, not abstract concepts. Survival meant integration. And integration meant understanding their world, on their terms. It meant finding food, shelter, and a way to not stick out like a sore thumb. Or, more accurately, like a future dweller in a wool tunic. I chuckled to myself, a dry, humorless sound. This was going to be a long education. Longer, perhaps, than any PhD program I could have imagined. And probably less comfortable. Forget tenure, I needed to learn how to hunt for my next meal. Or, more likely, how to beg for it. The sound of the bells, still echoing from the monastery, suddenly seemed less like a beacon and more like a gentle, persistent reminder that I was now firmly anchored in their time, their rhythm, their beliefs. The air still carried the scent of wood smoke, but now, mixed with it, was the faint, earthy smell of damp, cultivated soil, the scent of a world reliant on the earth's bounty. It was a scent that spoke of hard work, of constant struggle, but also of a deep, abiding connection to the land. Time drifts. My stomach aches, a hollow echo of past meals. My scavenged knife is useless here, I need tools for a different kind of survival. My water skin is empty. I'm still nestled in the tree line, damp leaves clinging to my rough clothes. The sounds of the village are fading, replaced by the persistent chirping of unseen birds. The smell of wood smoke lingers, a faint promise of warmth I can't yet reach. Whispers of old-world comfort, dreams of hot coffee and a soft bed, fade. A new whisper takes hold, find warmth. Find food. Survive. My hunger, a dull ache that had become a constant companion, sharpened into a fierce, insistent pang as I watched the villagers go about their morning routines. My eyes, still adjusting to this ancient world, scanned for any sign of food, anything edible. Then I saw it. A group of men, burly and strong, emerged from a cluster of larger, more substantial buildings at the edge of the village, carrying heavy wooden barrels. The faint, yeasty scent of fermentation, sweet and slightly acrid, drifted on the air. Ale. My mind, ever pragmatic, made an immediate connection. Where there was ale, there was often food. And where there was ale, there was often a tavern. Or an ale house, as I was quickly learning they called them here. I followed, keeping a safe distance, moving with the practiced stealth of a predator, or more accurately, a very hungry scavenger. The men grunted under the weight of the barrels, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't talking much, just focused on the task at hand. This was work, hard work, in a world where everything was earned by the sweat of your brow. My modern muscles, used to a life of convenient automation, already ached in sympathy. No wonder they moved so slowly, every movement was an effort. As they approached one of the larger, darker buildings, clearly the ale house, its windows small and grimy, its door a heavy slab of rough-hewn timber, the scent of ale became stronger, richer, almost intoxicating. It was a complex aroma, a blend of malt, hops, and something else, something earthy and raw that spoke of ancient brewing traditions. It was nothing like the sanitized, mass-produced beers of my time. This was real ale, brewed by hand, with all the imperfections and character that entailed. A mainstream historical fact about medieval brewing clicked into place: ale was not just a drink, it was a staple. Water sources were often contaminated, making ale a safer and more common beverage for all ages, including children. It was a source of calories, too, a vital part of the daily diet. So, yes, beer meant survival here. Not just a pleasant evening tipple, but a fundamental necessity. The thought was both fascinating and deeply humbling. I, who had once grumbled about the price of craft beer, was now staring at its raw, fundamental purpose. And suddenly, a cold pint seemed less a luxury and more an absolute, life-sustaining need. I watched, mesmerized, as the men wrestled the barrels inside. The door creaked open, revealing a glimpse of a dark, smoky interior, filled with the low hum of voices. This was it. My entry point, perhaps. Or my undoing. I had to get inside, or at least close enough to observe, to understand the dynamics of this place. Then, a quirky, unusual detail unfolded before my eyes, something so bizarre and unexpected that it stopped me dead in my tracks. A man, dressed in rough, stained clothes, emerged from the ale house, carrying a small, shallow wooden basin. He walked purposefully to a cleared patch of earth just outside the door, where a puddle of dark, viscous liquid had collected. My stomach lurched. Was that ale? Spillover? He placed the basin down, then, with a solemn, almost ritualistic air, he sat down in the puddle. Yes, you heard that right. He sat in it. Not just dipping a toe, or a hand, but a full-on, unceremonious plop into the puddle of ale. He squirmed a little, making sure his rough breeches were thoroughly soaked. Then, he simply, sat there. For a long, silent moment. Then he slowly stood up, turned, and presented his ale-soaked backside to another man who had just emerged from the tavern, a man with a stern, appraising look. The second man sniffed, then bent down, almost delicately, and touched the wet fabric. He brought his fingers to his nose, then, astonishingly, to his tongue. He nodded slowly, then muttered something to the man who had done the sitting. This was it, the ale taster. I'd read about them in history books, but to see it in person, it was truly something. It was an ancient, peculiar method of quality control. Good ale, especially ale brewed with unadulterated malt, contained enough sugar to make it sticky. If the ale was watered down, or otherwise tampered with, it wouldn't be sticky enough to adhere to leather breeches. So, they'd pour a puddle, sit in it, and then stand up. If the breeches stuck to the bench, or in this case, the ground, it was good ale. If they didn't, well, someone was in trouble. Historians are still debating whether this practice was widespread or more localized, a kind of urban legend that became truth in certain areas, but witnessing it, I can tell you, it felt incredibly real. And profoundly strange. The sheer commitment to quality control, medieval style, was both admirable and absolutely insane. It certainly wasn't covered in any modern food safety course. My own professors would have had an aneurysm. As for the religious element, it was subtle, almost a background hum. The ale taster, before he sat in the puddle, briefly, almost imperceptibly, made the sign of the cross over the puddle. It was a small gesture, perhaps a prayer for purity, a plea for divine favor on the brew, or a ward against any malevolent spirits that might taint the ale. It was a quiet acknowledgement that even in the most mundane tasks, the sacred intertwined with the profane. A blessing, perhaps, for the lifeblood of the village. My mind drifted between centuries, witnessing this bizarre ritual. It was a tangible link, a visceral connection to a world where common sense was defined by entirely different parameters. And my own comfort level? Well, let's just say I was rethinking my aversion to lukewarm tap water. The thought of sitting in a puddle of spilled beer, no matter how pure, was not appealing. But then again, a hot shower seemed a million years away. And a full stomach felt even further. The bizarre spectacle of the ale taster, with his sticky breeches and solemn demeanor, left me with a strange mix of awe and bewildered amusement. My modern brain, wired for efficiency and sanitation, struggled to process such a ritual. It was a stark reminder that even the most basic acts of commerce and quality control were utterly alien in this world. My hunger, though, was far less abstract. It was a raw, undeniable craving, and the thought of the ale, even with its unusual testing methods, was becoming increasingly appealing. It meant calories. It meant a chance at survival. I lingered near the ale house, hidden in the shadows of a ramshackle shed, observing the comings and goings. The tavern keeper, a stout man with a booming laugh and a surprisingly gentle demeanor, was overseeing the unloading of more barrels. He barked orders, but there was a jovial quality to his voice. He seemed like a man who enjoyed his work, and perhaps, the product of it. After a while, seeing an opportunity, I swallowed my pride, a surprisingly easy task when your stomach is trying to eat itself, and approached him. My voice, when I finally managed to speak, came out rough and used. "Sir, I have no coin. But I can work. Anything. For a little bread." He squinted at me, his eyes, dark and intelligent, taking in my slightly out-of-place attire, the weariness etched on my face. He didn't question where I came from, or how I'd ended up in his village. Perhaps he'd seen stranger things. Or perhaps, in a world where life was hard, a desperate soul willing to work was not an uncommon sight. "Stables need cleaning," he grunted, pointing towards a low, thatched building behind the ale house. "Filthy things. If you don't mind the smell, there might be some stale bread for your efforts." Mind the smell? After weeks of living in a post-apocalyptic world that smelled perpetually of damp concrete and rust, horse manure was practically perfume. "Thank you, sir," I managed, my voice thick with relief. "Thank you." The stables were, as promised, filthy. The air was thick with the rich, pungent aroma of horse and straw, a surprisingly comforting smell after the pervasive damp earth of the forest. I set to work, finding a rough wooden shovel and a wheelbarrow. It was hard, honest labor, the kind that grounded you, forcing your mind away from impossible questions of time travel and back to the immediate, tangible reality of muck and sweat. As I worked, humming an old, half-forgotten tune, I overheard snippets of conversation drifting from the open door of the alehouse. The tavern keeper and another man, presumably a regular, were deep in discussion. They were talking about brewing, which immediately piqued my interest. "The secret, you see," the tavern keeper was saying, his voice a low rumble, "is the yeast. Ah, the good Lord's own magic, that is." And there it was, the religious element. The medieval understanding of fermentation was steeped in mysticism. They didn't know about single-celled organisms converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide, they saw it as a miracle, a divine gift. The yeast was often just the foamy residue left over from a previous batch, or simply wild yeasts present in the air and on grains. They called it God's gift, or Brew-God, a testament to their deep faith and their reliance on divine intervention for successful outcomes, particularly for something as vital as ale. Historians are still debating whether the consistent success of some medieval brewers stemmed from accidental knowledge of yeast propagation or genuine, albeit rudimentary, scientific observation of fermentation. There is no consensus on this matter. And perhaps, there will never be consensus. All I knew was that it was a reminder of how fundamentally different their worldview was from mine. My world had science, theirs had God. He went on to describe the process, his voice low and rich. How they mashed the malted barley, a mainstream historical fact. Malted barley was the primary grain for ale, as malting converted starches into fermentable sugars, and how they boiled it with hops. Hops, he explained, not just for flavor, but for preservation. Another useful, lesser-known detail, before hops became common, many alesh were flavored and preserved with a mixture of herbs and spices known as brut. The introduction of hops in brewing, largely credited to monasteries, was a significant advancement in the longevity and stability of ale. This was exactly the kind of practical, historical science I found fascinating. It was like a living history lesson, presented by a man who didn't know he was teaching it. A quirky, unusual detail I overheard: the tavern keeper mentioned that his grandmother used to add a bit of ginger to her brew, not for flavor, but because she believed it kept evil spirits from souring the ale. A blend of folk wisdom, superstition, and perhaps, a genuine observation of ginger's antimicrobial properties, unknowingly applied. It was a charming little insight into the blend of magic and practical knowledge that governed their lives. I shoveled the last of the manure, my back protesting, but a sense of accomplishment warming me. The stale bread, when the tavern keeper finally handed it to me, was a revelation. It was hard, dense, and had the faint, earthy taste of ancient grains, but it was food. Real food. I devoured it, slowly, savoring every crumb. It wasn't gourmet, not by a long shot, but it was sustenance, a tangible link to survival in this bewildering new reality. My body, though still aching, felt a strange kind of calm settle over it. The simple act of working, of earning my keep, had brought a measure of peace. No time for existential dread when you're elbow deep in horse manure. With the stale bread a comforting lump in my stomach, I sought out a place to rest. The ale house, though bustling with the low hum of voices and the clatter of tankards, felt too open, too exposed. My instincts, honed by years of precarious survival, screamed for a hidden corner, a dark sanctuary where I could truly observe without being observed. My gaze fell upon the brewery loft, a dark aperture above the main brewing area, accessible by a rickety wooden ladder. It looked cold, uninviting, but private. Perfect. I waited until the last of the patrons had stumbled out into the twilight, their drunken laughter echoing in the now darkened village. The tavern keeper, a man of surprising discipline, secured the heavy wooden door with a stout bar, plunging the interior into near total darkness, save for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Slipping in quietly before he locked up, I navigated by touch, my hands brushing against rough-hewn beams and the earthy scent of spilled ale. The ladder creaked ominously under my weight, but I ascended silently, pulling myself into the small, dusty loft. The air up here was thick with the rich, yeasty aroma of fermentation, a living, breathing smell that promised warmth and sustenance. Below me, in the cavernous brewing space, I could hear the faint gurgle of liquids, the slow drip of condensation. It was a symphony of creation, played out in the dark. I curled into a tight ball, nestling against the rough, splintered wood of a stack of empty mead barrels. The wood was cold, but the air, strangely, felt a degree warmer than outside, a byproduct of the active fermentation below. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by memories of home. Not the old, pristine home, but the one I'd known in the post-apocalyptic world. The shelter, crude but familiar. The distant, comforting rumble of the dilapidated city. The taste of instant noodles, salvaged from a forgotten supermarket. Here, there were no instant noodles. There was just the cold, hard reality of medieval life. The contrast was a sharp, painful ache in my chest. What was my mother doing? Was she even alive? The questions spun in my mind, a relentless torture. This wasn't just physical displacement, it was a profound, soul-wrenching homesickness. It was the kind of emotional depth that stripped away all pretense, all modern cynicism, leaving you raw and vulnerable. To cope with the disorienting shock of time traveling, I started to mentally catalog everything. Every sound, every smell, every texture. It was a grounding exercise, a way to force my mind to focus on the immediate, tangible world rather than spiraling into the abyss of impossible questions. The faint creak of the wooden beams overhead, the rhythmic drip-drip of condensation, the distant hoot of an owl from the forest. These became my anchors, tiny points of reality in a sea of unreality. A mainstream historical fact about medieval homes: privacy was a luxury almost unheard of, especially for common folk. Most lived in single-room dwellings, often sharing space with their livestock for warmth. The idea of a separate bedroom, let alone a private loft, was almost entirely foreign. My little corner in the brewery, while uncomfortable, was a sanctuary compared to the crowded, communal living of the era. It made me appreciate the simple luxury of solitude, something I'd taken for granted in my own time. And then, a quirky, unusual detail I picked up on as my senses sharpened in the dark, a small, rough-hewn wooden crucifix, no bigger than my thumb, nailed to one of the central support beams directly above the fermentation vats. It was barely visible in the gloom, but I felt it more than saw it. This was a direct, albeit small, religious element. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a protective charm, a silent prayer for the brew's success, a ward against souring, a belief that God's blessing was essential for every aspect of life, even something as seemingly mundane as making beer. Many documents leave open the possibility that such small, personal devotions were far more prevalent than the grand, public ceremonies, reflecting a deep, personal faith that permeated every corner of their existence. There is no consensus on this matter. And perhaps there will never be consensus on the full extent of such hidden acts of piety. I thought about the role of monasteries in medieval society, another bit of historical knowledge. They weren't just centers of religious devotion, they were often economic powerhouses, agricultural innovators, and, importantly, the best brewers of their time. They perfected techniques, cultivated specific strains of yeast, unknowingly, of course, and often served as safe havens, places of sanctuary for travelers and the needy. Perhaps the bells I heard earlier were from one such place. The idea of sanctuary, of a safe haven, felt like a distant, impossible dream in my current predicament. The cold was creeping in, a damp, pervasive chill that gnawed at my extremities. My modern body, used to climate control and heated blankets, protested vehemently. I missed the convenience of a modern heating system, the ability to simply flick a switch and banish the chill. Here, warmth was a constant struggle, earned with fire and layers of rough wool. It made me think about how much we rely on technology, how many of our basic comforts are entirely dependent on infrastructure that simply didn't exist here. It was a humbling thought. My survival skills in the old world felt suddenly inadequate in this new context. Building a fire from scratch, for instance. I'd read about it, seen videos. But actually doing it in the damp, cold reality of a medieval night? That was a different story entirely. I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound in the dark. At least I wasn't trying to charge my phone. The morning after my uncomfortable, barrel-adjacent sleep in the brewery loft, I woke with a stiff neck and a renewed sense of purpose. My meager meal of stale bread had done little to truly sate the gnawing hunger, but it had provided enough energy to think. My options were brutally limited: steal, starve, or beg. The latter, while a blow to my modern pride, seemed the most pragmatic and least likely to land me in a medieval dungeon. Or worse, accused of witchcraft for my strangely preserved clothing. I cautiously descended the creaky ladder, the brewery still quiet in the pre-dawn gloom. The air was thick with the familiar, yeasty scent, oddly comforting now. I slipped out into the village, aiming for what I'd observed as the most likely gathering spot for the less fortunate, the area around the church gate. The church, a sturdy stone building with a squat bell tower, dominated one end of the village square. Its presence was undeniable, a physical manifestation of the pervasive religious faith that shaped this world. As I approached, I saw them, a small cluster of figures huddled near the massive, oaken gate, their faces gaunt, their clothes patched and ragged. Beggars. My new peer group, it seemed. I joined them, awkwardly at first, trying to mimic their slumped postures and downcast gazes. It felt alien, utterly humiliating, but necessity was a harsh teacher. One old woman, her eyes sharp and knowing despite her frail frame, cast a quick, appraising glance my way. She saw the unfamiliarity in my eyes, the slight stiffness in my posture. "New to the road, lad?" she croaked, her voice raspy, like dry leaves. I nodded, unable to form a coherent lie. She simply grunted, then offered me a piece of advice, her voice low. "Say your prayers. The Lord provides. And folk are more likely to give if they think you're devout." And there it was, the religious element woven into the very fabric of survival. Begging wasn't just about desperation, it was a performance, a silent plea to the community's ingrained sense of charity and Christian duty. You weren't just asking for food, you were appealing to their faith, their hope for salvation through good works. The concept of almsgiving was a mainstream historical fact deeply rooted in medieval Christian society. It was considered a virtue, a path to spiritual merit, and a way to mitigate one's sins. This wasn't just about feeling good, it was about earning your way into heaven. Which, for the beggars, meant a shot at breakfast. I listened, absorbing their unspoken lessons. They didn't shout or demand. They sat, silently, sometimes murmuring prayers, occasionally offering a humble greeting to passers-by. Their voices were low, almost melodic in their supplication. I began to pick up on the specific phrases they used, the holy words. God bless you, good sir/madam. In God's grace, a crust of bread. For the love of Christ. It was a vocabulary of humility, a language designed to appeal to the deeply held religious convictions of the villagers. A quirky, unusual detail I noticed was how some of the beggars held small, polished stones or bits of bone in their hands, rubbing them rhythmically. At first, I thought they were just fidgeting. But then I saw an old man discreetly press his lips to a smooth, gray pebble before extending his hand for a coin. These weren't just stones, they were touchstones, small, personal talismans believed to offer comfort, protection, or even a direct line to divine favor. They weren't explicitly Christian, but they coexisted with Christian beliefs, a blend of folk superstition and personal piety. Many documents leave open the possibility that these everyday practices, seemingly pagan, were often quietly tolerated or even integrated into popular Christian worship, especially in rural areas, showing a blend of old traditions and new faith. There is no consensus on this matter. And perhaps there will never be consensus on how much ancient beliefs truly shaped medieval Christianity. I tried a few of the phrases, my voice stiff and self-conscious at first. God bless you, I mumbled to a woman carrying a basket of vegetables. She paused, looked at me, and placed a small, gnarled apple in my outstretched hand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was earned. And it tasted like victory. The psychological aspect of begging was fascinating. It wasn't just about the immediate need for food, it was about learning to shed modern ego, to embrace vulnerability, to truly rely on the kindness of strangers. It was a profound lesson in humility, something my old, self-sufficient self would have balked at. But here, survival dictated a complete re-evaluation of what it meant to be strong. Sometimes, strength was admitting you were weak. I thought about the concept of penance. For the medieval mind, suffering was often seen as a path to salvation, a way to atone for sins. The beggars, in their very state, were performing a kind of perpetual penance, relying on God's grace and the charity of others. It was a stark contrast to the modern idea of seeking comfort and avoiding hardship at all costs. Here, hardship was often embraced, even sought out, as a spiritual discipline. It was a tough pill to swallow for someone from a world built on instant gratification and avoiding discomfort. But, I had to admit, there was a strange, raw power in it. Time slips. The apple, a tiny sphere of tart sweetness, offers minimal energy. My pockets are empty. My modern sense of self is stripped bare. I sit by the rough stone wall of the church, the cold seeping through my worn tunic. The air carries the faint, sweet smell of incense from within the church, mixed with the ever-present earthiness of the village. A whisper of desperation, then a new resolve: humble yourself. Learn their ways. Survive. My hands, still gritty from the stable work and the humbling act of begging, trembled slightly as I held the gnarled apple. It was a meager offering, but it was mine, earned through humility and observation. As the day wore on, I continued to sit near the church, watching, listening. The constant murmuring of prayers, the slow procession of villagers, the occasional clang of the blacksmith's hammer from down the lane, it all began to weave into a strange, unsettling rhythm. It was a rhythm utterly divorced from the frantic pace of my old life, a slow, deliberate cadence that somehow felt both oppressive and oddly soothing. The most pressing issue, beyond the gnawing hunger, was my attire. While my self-appointed wool tunic and breeches were better than my original tactical gear for blending in, they were still too new, too clean, too uniform for a wandering pauper. They hadn't seen enough mud, enough wear, enough of the stains of hard living. To avoid drawing undue attention, a modern-day person like me, fresh from a world of synthetic fabrics and machine-made clothes, would stick out like a neon sign. And in a medieval village, drawing that kind of attention could be dangerous. People were suspicious of outsiders, especially those who didn't fit the expected mold. They might think I was a vagrant, a criminal, or worse, a sorcerer. So, under the deepening cloak of twilight, with the last rays of sun painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and faded orange, I became a thief. Not a grand, daring heist, but a quiet, desperate act. I scouted the outskirts of the village, looking for a forgotten laundry line, a discarded pile of rags. My eyes fell upon a small, derelict lean-to behind one of the more modest dwellings. It smelled faintly of sheep and damp straw, and a line, stretched between two wobbly posts, held a few items drying in the evening air. Rough-spun tunics, a pair of worn breeches, and a thick, hooded cloak. All faded, patched, and carrying the faint, comforting scent of human use. Perfect. My heart pounded as I crept closer, every rustle of leaves sounding like an alarm. My modern conscience screamed in protest, but my medieval survival instincts, rapidly taking root, silenced it. Necessity. I snatched the items, quick and silent as a shadow, and retreated back into the deeper shadows of the trees, my ill-gotten gains clutched tightly against my chest. The cloak, in particular, felt like a blessing, thick and heavy, promising warmth and anonymity. I quickly shed my slightly too new attire and pulled on the scavenged clothes. They were rough against my skin, itchy wool, but they felt right. They smelled of wood smoke and honest toil, of a life lived close to the earth. The subtle shift in my appearance, I hoped, would be enough to make me just another face in the crowd, another weary traveler. With my new disguise, I made my way back to the brewery. The tavern keeper, bless his practical soul, had left a small, heavy wooden door unbarred at the back, likely for early morning deliveries. Slipping inside, the familiar, comforting aroma of fermentation enveloped me. The loft, though still cold, was now a known quantity, a tiny pocket of perceived safety in a world that offered none. I climbed the rickety ladder, the stolen clothes rustling faintly. Curled once again amongst the empty mead barrels, the cold seeped into my bones, but the heavy cloak offered a measure of comfort. It smelled faintly of stale ale and human sweat, a primal blend that was, oddly, reassuring. As I tried to sleep, my mind drifted, caught between the echoing silence of the medieval night and the phantom hum of my old world. I missed the convenience of light switches, the simple joy of a hot cup of tea, the ubiquitous presence of information at my fingertips. Here, knowledge was passed by word of mouth, by observation, by hard-won experience. It was a sobering thought, how utterly dependent I had been on systems that no longer existed. A mainstream historical fact, clothing in the Middle Ages was incredibly valuable. It wasn't mass-produced, it was hand-spun, hand-woven, and hand-sewn, often from scratch. A single garment could take weeks, even months, to create. So, my act of theft, while born of necessity, was far more significant than simply grabbing a few items from a discount rack. It was a tangible loss for whoever owned them, a loss that could impact their ability to stay warm, to work, to survive. This wasn't just about fashion, it was about fundamental economics. As I lay there, shivering slightly, a quirky, unusual detail from earlier in the day resurfaced in my mind. One of the women at the well, while gossiping about the sickness, had subtly traced a small, almost invisible symbol on the outside of her water bucket with her finger, a tiny, barely discernible intertwined knot pattern. I'd read that such knots, often called endless knots, were ancient symbols in many cultures, sometimes adapted into Christian iconography, representing eternity, or the interconnectedness of life. Many documents leave open the possibility that these minor, almost subconscious gestures of everyday piety and superstition were far more common than grand, overt religious displays, reflecting a deep, ingrained spiritual worldview where every object could be blessed or cursed. There is no consensus on this matter. And perhaps, there will never be consensus on the precise meaning of such everyday rituals. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes about the layers of belief, superstition, and faith that permeated their lives, a gentle religious element woven into the mundane. The air in the loft, though warmer than outside, was still damp, carrying the heavy, sweet scent of malt and yeast. It was a constant reminder of the ale below, a strange, comforting presence. I focused on that smell, that silent, chemical process, trying to anchor myself in the present, to push back the encroaching waves of despair and homesickness. My old life felt like a dream now, distant and fading, replaced by the immediate, visceral reality of damp wool and cold wood. This was my new normal. And I had to find a way to live in it. The stolen clothes, rough and itchy as they were, offered not just warmth but a profound sense of camouflage. Blending in was paramount. My first taste of medieval ale came not from the tavern keeper's generosity, but from a shared, communal pot near the church gate, a small, dark wooden cup passed from hand to hand among the beggars. The sun, already high, beat down, but the air still held a lingering dampness, carrying the scent of drying mud and distant cook fires. The brew itself was unlike anything I had ever tasted. It was thick, cloudy, and surprisingly foamy, with a rich, malty sweetness that was immediately comforting. There was a faint, earthy tang to it, and a surprisingly low alcohol content compared to modern beers, a mainstream historical fact. Medieval ale was typically much weaker than modern beer, often brewed with a specific gravity closer to that of bread, making it a source of nutrition as much as refreshment. It was consumed throughout the day, by everyone, a fundamental part of the diet. My mind, still grappling with the sheer strangeness of it all, drifted between centuries. I remembered the crisp, clear lagers of my old world, the fizzy, carbonated brews that came in sterile cans. This was alive. Organic. It felt like drinking liquid history. As I took a long, slow swallow, the warmth spread through my chest, a small, welcome fire in the cold landscape of my new reality. It wasn't just the alcohol, it was the calories, the carbohydrates, the sheer, primal satisfaction of having something substantial in my empty stomach. It was surprisingly filling, almost like a thin gruel. My mind, perhaps loosened by the unfamiliar brew, began to wander. I thought of the convenience of my old life, the effortless access to clean drinking water from a tap, the endless variety of beverages available at the touch of a button. Here, every drop of potable liquid was a testament to human ingenuity and communal effort. The water from the well, the brewed ale, even the occasional rain-filled puddle, they were precious, not taken for granted. This simple, foamy brew was a direct link to the ingenuity of our ancestors, who figured out how to safely hydrate themselves in a world teeming with pathogens. A quirky, unusual detail I noticed as the cup was passed back to me: the lip of the wooden cup was worn smooth in one particular spot, as if countless hands had always touched it there. And etched into the wood, barely visible, was a tiny, faded cross. A subtle religious element, a blessing in the mundane act of drinking, a silent prayer for purity and health. It was a common practice, this weaving of faith into the everyday, something scholars still debate the exact origins of. Many documents leave open the possibility that this practice derived from ancient pagan customs of blessing vessels, later Christianized, though there is no consensus on this matter. And perhaps, there will never be consensus. The other beggars around me, their faces etched with the lines of hard lives, nodded in silent approval as I drank. There was a camaraderie in shared hardship, a bond forged in the crucible of poverty. We were all, in our own ways, dependent on the kindness of strangers, on the mercy of a world that offered little in the way of safety nets. This first taste of medieval ale was more than just a drink, it was a communion. It was a physical, tangible connection to this new world, a bridge between my past and my impossibly present. As the mild buzz settled in, my thoughts turned from the overwhelming terror of my situation to a strange, almost meditative calm. It was a small, quiet victory against the relentless assault of 1,000 years of time travel. The simple warmth, the familiar taste of grain transformed, it was enough to momentarily quiet the screaming anxiety, to push back the encroaching shadows of PTSD from my old, shattered world. For a moment, I wasn't a time traveler, or a modern survivor. I was just another person, sharing a cup of ale, under a medieval sun, grateful for the sustenance. The psychological shift was palpable. The ale, combined with the act of begging and blending in, slowly began to chip away at the rigidity of my modern mindset. It wasn't about clinging to the past, but about adapting, truly adapting, to the brutal realities of the present. The anxiety, which had been a constant hum beneath the surface, began to subside, replaced by a quiet resignation, a strange kind of peace. It was as if the simple, raw act of survival was forcing my mind to shed its layers of modern complexity, reducing everything to its most basic, fundamental elements: food, shelter, warmth, and the quiet dignity of simply being.